G'day everyone and welcome to episode number 33 of the Australian Rock Show. My name is Dennis Gray from the Rockin' and Rollin' Gray Brothers. Today is Friday the 21st of August 2015 when this show is being recorded. Michael Gudinski's contribution to Australian music is truly immense. Committed and passionate, his hard work and determination has helped influence Australian pop culture, and many of the artists he signed are still to be heard daily on commercial radio. Actually, it's a fair bet there'd be a record, cassette or CD in most Aussie households with a direct linkage to him. Gudinski, the Godfather of Australian Rock and Roll, is a new publication which has just hit the bookshops. And if you are a fan of Australian music or you just like fascinating biographies, you need to get a hold of this book. Last Tuesday, the 18th of August, we hooked up with the book's author, Stuart Coupe, to learn more about this publication, an interview which we'll get to in a moment. But before we do, let's get in the mood with a tune from a band who helped put Gudinski on the path to success and then some. Here are Skyhooks from 1974 with Carlton. Stuart, welcome to the Australian Rock Show.
Dennis, how are you doing?
Well, thank you, mate. Congratulations on the book. It's very insightful and I have learnt a lot. As a lifelong fan of Australian music, I have some knowledge of Michael Gudinski and Mushroom, but your book has increased that immensely. And it's the stories, obviously, which I found really interesting. So again, well done.
Thank you. No, I think, look, the thing with Michael is that, most people know the name a little bit and but they don't really know too much about him as a person. And, people say, oh, who is he? And I go, all right, have you got a Split Enz record? Have you got a Hunters and Collectors record? Have you got a Paul Kelly record, a Kylie Minogue record, a Jimmy Barnes record? I mean, they're all things that artists that Gudinski has nurtured over the years. And I say, have you been to see the Eagles or the Rolling Stones or the Foo Fighters or Madonna or the Rolling Stones or Bruce Springsteen or Bob Dylan or Frank Sinatra? And if they say yes, I go, they're Michael Gudinski too. He's the guy behind them all.
Well, the need for a book on Michael Gudinski was definitely there, and I think you've done a fantastic job. How long did it take you to write and complete the publication?
Look, it took, when I finally decided to write it, Dennis, it was about 18 months, but the whole process really for me, well, I first met Michael back in about 1984 when I was managing Paul Kelly, and I was involved in redoing his contracts with Mushroom Records back then. So I've known Michael since then. And then in 2003, I wrote a book called The Promoters, which was a look at the concert promoting industry in Australia. And Michael really liked the way he was portrayed in that book. And he, at last count, bought 170 copies of it at full price. Thank you. Mm-hmm. He signs them, gives them away to people as business cards. So, and it was at that point that I went, okay, he really is the most, I think, significant, powerful, and influential figure in the Australian music industry over the last 50 years. And I said to him, look, you like The Promoters, there really should be an entire book about you. And he just said, there will never be a book about me. There's not going to be a book. Don't even think about it. And he maintained that position for almost, at least a decade. And every time I'd see him, I'd go, bookmark. He'd go, forget it. There is not going to be a book. And a few years ago, he actually signed a copy of a big hardback volume that Frontier Touring put out to celebrate 30 years of concert touring in this country. And he wrote inside it, to Dear Stuart, this is as close as you will ever get to a book about me. And so he was really opposed to it. I think in a funny sort of way, at the moment, I don't exactly even know now what he thinks about this book. But I got to a point about 18 months ago where I just went, this is crazy. It's such an important, not just Michael's story, but it's a story about Australian rock and roll over the last 50 years. It's Australian popular music. And also, coincidentally and rather sadly, a few people that he was close to and that I knew well, passed away. And sure. I got to the point where I went, hang on, these stories are going to disappear. They need to be recorded. I mean, without putting, too pretentious a point on it, I mean, it is part of our history. And so I just, at that point, I went, hang on a second, Michael mightn't want a book, but I said to my publisher, Matthew Kelly, who was the publisher of The Promoters, I said, look, I think we should just start writing. I think I should just start talking to people and getting what stories I can down. Now, of course, initially everybody said, oh, is this an authorized book? And I said, no, it's not. Michael doesn't want a book. And they said, well, we'll check with him. And then, of course, I didn't hear from them again. And then about 8 months into the process, Dennis, I contacted a pretty important staff member from the 1980s called Michelle Higgins, who lives in upstate New York. And she was great. She just said, Stuart, I agree with you. It's such an important story. I'm not going to check with him. I'll just talk to you. Then, to cut a long story short, we had a bit of a domino effect with some other key figures agreeing to talk. Michael heard that these people were talking, so he became more relaxed in terms of me talking to people that work with him and around him. And then eventually he did sit for a couple of extended interviews, and I gave him the right to correct the book for factual errors, but I was very firm that I didn't want him to change, or I wasn't going to let him change my interpretation of events and things. So the end result is a book that I think if you asked Michael and I was out of earshot, he would probably tell you that he loves 60% of it. He's relaxed about 80% of it and really wishes the remaining 20% had been written differently or with a different perspective. But that's okay, because I didn't want to write, and I said that to him and to everyone that I talked to. I said, look, I don't want to write a whitewashed version of history. I'm a big fan of Michael's. He's done some amazing things for Australian music. He's a very successful businessman. And no, he hasn't got everything right. He's missed out on some bands. He's had things. So it was important that it didn't just read like, oh, this is a publicity book for Michael Gudinski, and people would be going, oh, how much did he pay Stuart to say all those great things about him?
Well,
I wasn't even interested in doing that.
In terms of fans who bought and grew up with the label, I mean, you may recall the book which Dave Warner put out for the Mushroom 25. That's really just historical, and I think your book goes much further than that, which is very, very vital. But the stories I just mentioned the stories earlier, and I found his earliest years pretty fascinating. You write that at 15 years old, Michael is running his own suburban dancers. His father, being a hard-working, no-nonsense, old-school type, didn't approve and kicked him out of home. I've got to ask, did the relationship ever improve as he became more successful?
No, it didn't. Though they always had a very fractious relationship. And Michael has said to me that one of his biggest regrets was that his father was not still alive when he toured Frank Sinatra, because he said that would have been the first thing that he would have done that would have had some validity in his father's eyes. So, no, sadly, his father passed away not too long after the first touring company that he had, Evans Gudinski, had some financial problems. So no, that relationship never really, as far as I'm aware, repaired itself. And just going back to your earlier point, Dennis, I mean, yes, I read Dave Warner's book, and that does a good job of the factual stuff. My thing was that I didn't really want to write a history of Mushroom Records. I didn't really want to write a history of Frontier Touring Company. I was really trying to write a book about Michael Gudinski. So a lot of the time I'd have all these sad stories, and then I'd go, but they're great rock and roll stories, they're great Australian music stories, but they're not telling me anything about Michael. So I had to sort of put them aside for maybe another book, another time. So I really just wanted to hone in on him.
Can I say that meeting and working with booking agent Bill Joseph was pivotal in his working life, wasn't it? I mean, it turned out to be an ideal apprenticeship.
Bill Joseph was a very pivotal figure in Michael's life, because, yes, he started, as a poster boy. He was, a junior booking agent, and that's where he really learnt that side of the business. He's been very lucky throughout his career, because he's had some significant people, inspirational people around him. Bill Joseph, clearly one of them. And then later, when he started the Mushroom record label, Alan Healy, who was for many, many decades the head of Festival Records, was was almost like a father figure to Michael as well. So I think, the two people that really taught him the mechanics of the business were Bill Joseph in terms of the live scene, booking, to an extent promoting, and just that nuts and bolts of putting bands out, what they do, negotiating fees for them and so forth. And Alan Healy taught him the mechanics of putting records out and marketing campaigns and promoting and just, how to run a record label. And both were very supportive of him. Obviously, Alan Healy for longer, because in the case of Bill Joseph, he got to a point where he actually became a rival of Bill's. So, and that's just kind of the way it was.
Well, Stuart, we kicked off this show tonight with the Skyhooks tune Carlton, lifted off Living in the 70s, an album which spent 16 weeks at number one, put Mushroom in the black, and for a long time was the highest selling album by an Australian act in Australia. The importance of Skyhooks' success in Gudinski's career can never be underestimated, can it? 2 or 3 times, I guess. No,
I mean, it was very, very crucial for Michael, because you have to sort of wonder, if Skyhooks hadn't come along, would Mushroom Records have survived?
That's one of my questions, because if Living in the 70s had have bombed, I realise it wouldn't have ended his career, but what do you think would have been his next move?
I suspect that it may certainly have slowed down the record label, and he may possibly have concentrated more on the live music side, which is where he really started. And he may have concentrated on his publishing business and his promoting. He was already promoting international tours, so he may have done that. But the Skyhooks were very pivotal. I always think that there's parallels with Richard Branson and Virgin Records in the UK, in that Branson similarly started a label. It quickly became a very credible label, as did Mushroom. Both of them were like hip labels to be associated with. Both started to flounder fairly early on. And in the case of Richard Branson, he found Mike Oldfield and his Tubular Bells. And in the case of Gudinski, he found Skyhooks. So I think, look, right place at the right time, but also it was a fantastic opportunity for Michael to shine at what he really is very good at. And, that's a hustler. That's a marketing guy. It's a promotions guy. He would just bend the ear of any radio station programmer, anyone who would stand still long enough to hear him talk about Skyhooks. And look, to this day, he hasn't changed. His current favourite band are the Rubens. And he approached us talking about the Rubens with probably the same fervour and passion that he would have approached talking to people about the Skyhooks in the mid-1970s.
What do you think Gudinski saw in Skyhooks which convinced him of their potential? Because the band originally cut demos for EMI before signing with Mushroom, correct?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, I think Michael probably saw in them something that Australia hadn't seen before. I think he would have seen something in their outrageousness. I think he would have been very attracted to not only the appearance of them, and to an extent a lot of the makeup and the sort of glam outfits came a little bit later. He always responds well to bands that other people are excited about. He's a great listener, and he would have picked up, he uses the word vibe 25 years after everyone else has stopped using it. So he would have picked up on the vibe that was surrounding Skyhooks. That would have excited him. I think he would have been excited by the combative intellect of the members of Skyhooks. And probably as much as anything, he would have loved the subject matter of Skyhooks' songs. I mean, Michael is a global citizen, as the cliches go, but he is also such a parochial Melbourne person. It wasn't until 1980, with the exception of Dave Warner from Perth, that Mushroom even signed a band that, from Sydney. And he would have listened to songs like, with references to Baldwin and Lygon Street and so forth, and he would have gone, this is my turf, they're singing about my city. And I think that would have been a big thing for him.
Okay.
And they were very different.
Skyhooks,
They were different, So they were very different from anything else that was around at the time.
Oh, agreed. And, of course, they went on to have more success for Mushroom, the 1983 reunion and the Jukebox in Siberia period, another number one back in 1990. I can't believe that's 25 years back. But Stuart, Gudinski and Mushroom had some pretty big bands in the stable in the 70s, as you've mentioned through your book, Dingo, Sports, Chain, Split Ends, to name a few. And although he signed Jimmy Barnes in the 80s and had major success with him, I still find it amazing that he didn't get a hold of Cold Chisel. Was it as simple as what you just alluded to, Chisel not being a Melbourne-based outfit, that he missed them?
No, he had the opportunity to sign Cold Chisel. The Adelaide manager who looked after Cold Chisel, Jeff Skews, Jeff Skews looked after two bands. One was Cold Chisel and one was called Stars. And this is one of the great rock stories. Jeff went to Melbourne to see Michael, looking to try and get record deals for both bands, and Gudinski just couldn't see what all the fuss was about with Cold Chisel. He maintains to this day, and I'm not sure I agree with him, but his position is that the demos that he heard were recorded with a singer other than Jimmy Barnes. Now, I'm not going to go too far into my feelings about that, but anyhow, that's what Michael says. And so he ended up signing the Stars, who were, a country rock sort of tinge band, which probably reminded him of the Dingoes and some of the other things on Mushroom Records that he'd already, had a degree of at least critical success with. So he passed on Chisel, and obviously I think grew to regret it. He doesn't shy away from it. He just said, look, I didn't get it. One of the things about Michael that he's fairly good about is that if he misses out on things, he doesn't tend to hide it. He said, I didn't pass on Men at Work once, I passed on them twice. He said, I just didn't get it. Sure. On the other hand, when it came to Silverchair in the 90s, he desperately wanted Silverchair, but he was out-negotiated and out-manoeuvred by John Watson and John O'Donnell from Murmur Records, a Sony offshoot. So, he's missed some along the way. Glenn Wheatley wanted him to sign Little River Band, but he didn't. So, and that's not really criticism of Michael, it's just the way things go. And as far as he was concerned, he couldn't hear what was in Cold Chisel at that time, and we've got to remember that was very early days for Cold Chisel. He thought that they already had, via associates, a leaning towards Warner, Warner Brothers, where they eventually did sign, and at that point in time, it just didn't work for him. So I guess that's okay.
I think that, and of course, Mushroom did eventually release Cold Chisel product, which was the Last Wave of Summer album in 1998. But as I learned from your book, it was the lead up to this event, which I found really interesting. Barnes was living on a farm in France in the mid-90s, still hoping to break Europe with his Cyclone album, which never happened. Money's pouring out. And looking back, that reformation of Cold Chisel worked incredibly well for all parties involved, although tying it all together seemed incredibly involved, didn't it?
It was very involved because at that point, of course, Cold Chisel were very, very successful, so they were in a very, very powerful bargaining position. There were elements in the Cold Chisel camp who were not the biggest of fans of Michael. There would have been people that were questioning his closeness to Jimmy and whether he felt the same way and had the same, rapport with the rest of the band. And there was also, questions about what the future of Mushroom Records was going to be. Sure. And certainly, there are allusions from people that I quote in the book that he was, in terms of the record, maybe a little bit more interested in bolstering the Mushroom roster, knowing full well that he was soon to sell the remaining 50% of the label to Rupert Murdoch. And, other people have suggested that he was very shrewd in that, he offered Cold Chisel a pretty amazing deal at the time because, he was partnered up already with Rupert Murdoch. So it was partly Murdoch money as well, and that what he really wanted, which he didn't ultimately get, but what he really wanted was Frontier Touring Company to be the promoters of the Cold Chisel tour, because they didn't have to share that with Rupert Murdoch. That was all money for, the Frontier Touring Company. So, whether it was that premeditated, only some of the people a little closer to me than me to the situation could tell you that, Dennis. But put it this way: when Michael read the book for factual errors, he didn't get on the phone and bark at me saying that I'd got any of that wrong. Okay. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you an off-the-track question. You may know there was a Canadian label also called Mushroom who had massive success with the early Heart material. Was Gudinski ever bothered about their existence? Do you know?
Oh yeah. I mean, he knew very much of what they were doing, which was why he's never been, even to this day, been able to use the name Mushroom in North America and Canada. So when he started up his first foray into the American market in the early 1980s, and I didn't know this until I was talking to him. I just thought he called the label Oz Records because Australia was flavour of the month in the early 1980s. But he wanted to call it Mushroom, but he legally couldn't do that. And also when he started up publishing ventures in America, he called them, I think it was Bunyip, because he also couldn't call it Mushroom Music Publishing. So no, he was very aware of the other company and the legalities involved in him using that name in North America. He was okay to use it in the UK and Europe, but certainly not, and as far as I'm aware, not to this day in the UK, in the US and Canada.
Mate, we're going to play another song, and it's in fact by a band often referred to as the very first Sydney band signed to Mushroom, though I think Old 55 could technically take that title. Obviously also on Mushroom, but they were pieced together in Sydney in the early 70s. I am, of course, referring to the Sunny Boys, and we're going to hear their 1981 single, Happy Man. Released in 1981 on Mushroom Records, that was the Sunny Boys with Happy Man, still sounding as infectious as ever, a track which incidentally peaked at number 26 on the Australian charts. Is that technically correct?
With Old 55, that's actually an interesting one, and probably a good point. And I mean, Old 55, yeah, I think we would probably. Glenn Baker, their manager, was based in Sydney,
sure.
but also, I probably didn't give them the credit that I should have done for Mushroom, the bridging band between Skyhooks and Split Ends, because there was that period. It was a brief period, but when Old 55 were phenomenally successful and kept the coffers ticking over for Mushroom, and then it was very barren until basically the Sunny Boys and the Machinations in the early 1980s, and that was when Michael started for the first time. He opened a Sydney office, and principally that was because of the Sunny Boys.
Well, we're not going to spoil all the great stories contained in your book. If listeners want to hear them, they'll have to buy a copy. However, the one which the mainstream press are picking up on is the signing in 1987 of Kylie Minogue to Mushroom. So the story basically goes, and please correct me, that originally Gudinski wanted nothing to do with signing Kylie, thinking his rock credibility would suffer. Yet it was in part the excited reaction by his two young nieces at the mention of Minogue which contributed to the change of heart. Is that the story?
That's pretty accurate, because we've got to remember that, by the mid-1980s, Mushroom were incredibly successful. They were a very, hip, credible, rock label. And so when a cassette tape of this, actor from a soap opera started circulating around the office, she was singing a cover version of a song that had been a hit a long time earlier for Little Eva, the locomotion. And he didn't, Mushroom was not at this stage a dance pop label. And so, I think it would be fair to say that he didn't kind of know and didn't have a sense that this was something that Mushroom should be going into. The demo was in the office. He handballed it across to Amanda Pellman, who saw something in it. And then she enlisted Gary Ashley, who for 25 years was Michael's right-hand person at the record label. And they sort of ran with it. Stock Aitken and Waterman picked it up in the UK. But, it wasn't just Michael. It was a lot of the staff at his office were just going, what are we doing? This is going to erode all of our credibility, our hipness. No hip artists are going to come near us anymore. We don't know what to do with dance music. We don't know what to do with pop music. Having said that, history tells us that Kylie Minogue was the most successful artist signed to Mushroom Records. But also, it needs to be pointed out that, a lot of people like Michael Gudinski aren't necessarily totally excited by all of the people that they sign or assign to their labels in the early days. And once Kylie started to get some attention, Michael has been, unwavering in his support and his commitment to Kylie. So yes, it's true that he wasn't a card-carrying member of the Kylie Minogue fan club in the very early days. Is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily. It rankles him. It's one of the sections in the book that he's very clearly said to me that he would have liked me to have rewritten to maybe sort of place himself a bit more centrally in the story of Kylie. But that's just I don't think he should stress about that. And as John Watson, the very, 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 respected manager says, he should be relaxed and say, hey, I was the guy who had the smarts to sign the woman who had the smarts to sign Kylie. And just leave it at that.
Well, actually, he was quoted as saying to former director Gary Ashley something like, I don't want anybody telling me what my record company should or shouldn't do. We do pop music. We do everything. And I guess a good example of Mushroom doing everything even before Kylie was releasing left of center stuff like George Smilovich in 84, also that Mark Jacko Jackson 7-inch, I'm an Individual. Both did very well on the charts. And I know Jackson played for St Kilda and Gudinski is a massive fan. What do you think what was the thinking behind releasing novelty material like that?
That's actually a very good point. Look, Michael there would be a couple of things, Michael would think that was an avenue that the label could go into. He also, he has a fantastic history of working with really talented and smart, astute people. A lot of women, which is one of the things that he's not given nearly enough credit for. And it could have been as simply as, the vibe was good amongst a whole bunch of people to do records like that. That's what I was saying with Kylie. He will quite often just pick up on things and he'll hear word of mouth. He'll hear people talking and he'll go, oh, well, why don't we give that a go? Why don't we try that? And then where he comes into his forte is when there starts to be a groundswell support for that particular artist or a particular record. Then, Michael moves in with his trademark and quite legendary enthusiasm and hustling and, intense promotion. And then, more often than not, away things go. In the case of Jacko, whether it had something to do with St Kilda, I wouldn't be at all surprised either.
Well, come to think of it, even Mother Goose were another band Mushroom signed who would also nearly fall into that novelty category as well, looking back.
You're making me think about that Baked Beans song that I never wanted to think about ever again. Thank you very much, Dennis.
Do you know what? This isn't a criticism, but I always found it odd that Mushroom had a lot of bands on their roster, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, bands who, in my opinion, put out great material but received hardly any push from the label at that time. And those records sunk pretty quickly. I'm alluding to bands Have a Nice Day, The Shivers, Chrome by the Dubrovniks, Star World, spring to mind. If I said that to Gudinski, what do you think his response would be?
He would. He'd probably say a couple of things. He would probably look, if he was quite honest, he would probably concede that they were records that came out at a time when he wasn't as focused on the label as what he might have been at other times. It's been a long career for him, and there have been times Michael juggles a lot of balls, and for the most part, he manages through just, an unstoppable energy and very good people around him to keep most of those balls in the air. But I think he would concede that there are periods when Mushroom maybe weren't as on their game as a record label. No record label is on their game for 40 years. It just doesn't happen.
Sure.
And so, there were some periods when maybe they weren't across things. Maybe the sort of records that they were releasing were a little out of kilter at the time with what radio was playing. And I know that drives him crazy to this day. That, there are certain points when radio goes, okay, we're not playing records by, 4 white blokes with guitars, and that's not the mood of the times. And then other times, for instance, you have someone like Paul Kelly, who I was intimately involved with, has 3 albums, and then it's right place at the right time for radio with a song like Before Too Long. Paul Kelly had written and recorded songs as equally as good, if not better, than Before Too Long. And Darling It Hurts, but they were the right record at the right time. And you talk about a band like the Dubrovniks, maybe if their record had come out at a different time, and the mood of radio was a little different, the mood of the music press was a little bit different, and Mushroom was a little more focused. Maybe the Dubrovniks, might have scaled. I mean, I don't believe they would ever have become like the Sunny Boys, but they might have been, just to single out one of the bands you mentioned, more successful than what they ultimately became. But it wasn't to be. And Michael, Gudinski and Mushroom are like every record label. You look back at their history, and as I did with Dave Warner's terrific book, you realise that but they all have a lot of artists that they sign that don't make it. And Michael's a very divisive figure. There are a lot of people around who, particularly people who have been signed to the label that haven't been successful. And they go, oh, Mushroom, oh, Michael. I'm yet to find this mythical beast that I'm told does exist, Dennis, who actually says, well, the reason we didn't sell triple platinum was maybe because that record wasn't very good and we didn't tour as hard as we should have done, and maybe we didn't do all the interviews we had to do, and et cetera, et cetera. It's always very convenient, to turn on the manager or the record label or someone of that nature. And sometimes it just doesn't happen. It just can be the best possible record. Your record collection and mine, I'm sure, is full of great records that just didn't sell a lot of copies, sometimes at the time, and sometimes they still haven't. And it was just the way the wind was blowing that day, and that didn't happen. I've released over 200 albums on my record label, Laughing Out Loud. I still haven't had a Skyhooks or a Paul Kelly or a Hunters and Collectors. Doesn't mean I don't love every one of those 200 records. They just haven't hit a chord with people. So, it's just the way it goes.
Mate, we better wrap this up. And Stuart, thank you for your time tonight, and congratulations once again. It's a massive effort you've undertaken, but very much appreciated by many of us who love Australian music. The book is called Gudinski. It's written by Stuart Coupe, and it's in the shops and available online now.
Thanks, Dennis. Great to talk to you. Thank you.